Zara sat across the table from her mother, trying to hide her nerves. Dinner with her was always stiff and uncomfortable, but tonight felt even stranger. Just as Zara reached for her glass, her mother pushed a white envelope toward her with a smile that wasn't really a smile. Zara opened it, expecting maybe a letter or a photo. Instead, her hands froze. Inside was a typed invoice, neat and bold at the top, $60,000 owed. The breakdown was worse: rent, groceries, school fees, all written as if Zara had been nothing more than a tenant. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Was this some kind of joke? She looked up, but her mother only leaned back, smirking like she'd already won. Zara's laugh came out sharp, shaky. "You're charging me for existing?" she asked. But before she could say more, her uncles and aunties, who had been quietly watching, began to clap. They nodded in approval, calling it tradition, calling it respect. Her cheeks burned as they spoke about honoring your parents. Instead of protecting her, they joined her mother in turning her into a debtor. The betrayal stung more than the so-called bill. Zara sat there, surrounded, humiliated, and utterly alone. She pressed the envelope flat against the table, her jaw tight, her heart racing. On the outside she stayed calm, but inside she made a silent promise. They could laugh, clap, and call it culture. They could try to trap her with shame. But one day soon, she would show them the truth. Zara let out a small laugh, hoping it would break the tension, hoping someone at the table would see how ridiculous the whole thing was. $60,000. An invoice for being raised? Surely her mother was joking. But instead of laughter, instead of someone speaking up for her, the room exploded in claps. Her uncles leaned back in their chairs, nodding in agreement. Her aunties clicked their tongues and pointed at the paper like it was holy scripture. One of them said loudly, "Yes, this is our African tradition. A child must pay back their parents." Another added, "It is the least you can do for the woman who gave you life." Their words hit Zara harder than the bill itself. She looked around the table, searching for a single kind face, someone to defend her, but all she saw were proud smiles. They were cheering her mother on like she had pulled off something clever. Her chest tightened. These were the same people who once told her family meant love, protection, sacrifice. Now they were acting like she was some selfish outsider who owed a debt for being born. She wanted to shout, to ask them where they were when she had no lunch money, when she had to work odd jobs at 13 to buy her own books. But the words caught in her throat. If she spoke now, they would only laugh louder. So she stayed silent, swallowing her anger as her mother basked in her moment of victory. The humiliation burned deep. It wasn't just her mother's betrayal, it was the way the whole family ganged up, turning tradition into a weapon. They wanted to shame her into obedience, to make her small. But beneath the silence, something fierce began to rise inside Zara. She kept her face calm, letting them think they had won. Yet in her heart, she swore a quiet promise. They would not define her worth. They would not decide her value. If they thought she would bow her head and pay for her own childhood, they had no idea who she truly was. That night, alone in her room, Zara replayed every word, every clap, every smirk. The laughter of her uncles still echoed in her ears. The approving nods of her aunties burned in her memory. She stared at the envelope on her desk, the numbers printed in black and white, and felt something harden in her. She was done trying to please people who only wanted to use her. She was done carrying the weight of shame they tried to throw on her shoulders. For the first time, Zara felt strangely calm. The betrayal cut deep, yes, but it also gave her clarity. Her family could laugh, her mother could gloat, the whole town could whisper if they wanted to. None of them would have the final say over her life. Zara did not know how yet, but she promised herself one thing before she closed her eyes that night: one day soon, the truth would come out, and when it did, every clap, every smirk, and every word they had thrown at her would turn to silence. Weeks passed after that awful dinner, and Zara thought maybe her mother would drop the matter. But instead, her phone buzzed one morning with a message that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just another demand or insult. It was an official court summons. Her mother had actually filed a lawsuit, demanding that Zara pay her $60,000 as if she were a stranger owing rent. Zara held the papers in her hands, the black letters almost laughing at her. For a moment, she just sat there in silence, wondering how far her mother's madness would go. Now it wasn't just family business. Now it was public. It didn't take long for the news to spread. The small town thrived on gossip, and this was the juiciest story in years. At the market, Zara felt eyes following her. Strangers whispered behind her back. "That's the girl who refuses to pay her mother." At church, people shook their heads as she walked by. Some muttered that she was ungrateful, heartless, cursed. Others whispered that she was a bad example to the younger ones. Everywhere she went, the same judgment hung heavy in the air. Her mother painted herself as a poor, suffering parent who had sacrificed everything. And Zara, in their eyes, had become the selfish daughter who wouldn't give back. But Zara never defended herself. She didn't run around explaining her side. She didn't scream about the years of neglect or the nights she went to bed hungry. She didn't remind them that her father had left money for her care, money her mother had taken for herself. Instead, Zara stayed calm. She walked through the whispers with her head high and a small smile on her face. People thought she was arrogant, maybe even guilty. But that smile held a secret. She knew something they didn't. At night, when the town buzzed with rumors, Zara sat quietly with her folder. Inside were the documents she had kept for years, receipts, hospital reports, court papers. Proof of everything. Proof that while her mother claimed to have raised her, Zara had been raising herself. Proof that her mother hadn't been a saint, but someone who pocketed money meant for her child. Zara flipped through the papers, page after page, her smile growing stronger. She knew the day was coming when the truth would walk into that courtroom beside her. Her mother thought she was winning. Her family thought tradition was on their side. The town thought Zara was weak and ashamed. But Zara wasn't afraid of the noise. She had learned long ago that silence could be powerful. Let them gossip, let them laugh, let them judge. Soon, the same mouths that called her ungrateful would fall silent in shock. Because Zara wasn't the one on trial, not really. She was waiting, quietly, for the perfect moment to turn the tables. And when that day came, it wouldn't be her reputation at stake. It would be her mother's. For years Zara had carried a secret that no one knew about. She didn't tell her friends, she didn't tell her teachers, and she definitely didn't tell her family. While her mother shouted about sacrifice and tradition, Zara was quietly building her own shield, piece by piece. Every receipt, every letter, every forgotten court order, she kept them safe like treasures. When other kids her age collected diaries or photos, Zara collected evidence. She knew her mother's version of the story was only half the truth, and one day, she might need to prove it. It all began when she was just a little girl, confused about why there was never enough food in the house. Her father had passed away, but people whispered that he had left money for her care. Zara started noticing things, envelopes that arrived and disappeared quickly, her mother buying herself new clothes while Zara wore the same torn uniform. She didn't understand it fully back then, but something felt wrong. By the time she was 13, she understood enough. She was working odd jobs after school, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, babysitting, just to feed herself. Meanwhile, her mother still pretended she was the one carrying all the burden. Zara kept everything. Old pay stubs from her teenage jobs. Receipts that showed her buying her own food. Hospital reports proving neglect when she fainted from hunger. Letters that showed her father's child support money had been paid, but never used for her. Piece by piece, she stacked the truth against the lies her mother told. Each paper was a wound, but also a weapon. Sometimes, late at night, Zara would open the folder and read through it all. The memories made her chest tighten, but at the same time, they gave her strength. Every page reminded her she wasn't crazy, she wasn't ungrateful, and she wasn't the villain her family tried to paint her as. Her mother had not raised her out of love. She had raised her out of greed, taking money meant for her daughter and leaving Zara to survive alone. That secret file became Zara's armor. She never flaunted it, never spoke about it, but she knew its value. While her mother walked around boasting to the family and spreading gossip in the town, Zara held the real story in her hands. It was heavy, but it was also powerful. She didn't need to shout to the world. She just needed to wait. And now, with a court date on the horizon and the town already judging her, Zara knew the time was finally coming. Her mother thought she had cornered her with shame and tradition, but Zara had been preparing for this battle long before it began. She didn't fear the summons, or the whispers, or even the family who had betrayed her. Because when the moment came, she would open that file. And the truth inside would be louder than every clap, every insult, and every lie ever told about her. The morning of the court case, the whole town seemed to be buzzing. People who had whispered about Zara for weeks now gathered to see the drama unfold. The courtroom was full, with neighbors, distant relatives, even strangers squeezing into the benches just to watch. Zara walked in quietly, her head high, her folder tucked firmly under her arm. She could feel the eyes on her, the murmurs following her every step. To them, she was the ungrateful daughter about to be forced to pay her dues. To her mother, this was the final victory. But Zara knew something none of them did, and that knowledge kept her steady. When the case began, her mother's lawyer stood tall and confident. He held up the so-called bill like it was sacred. He painted Zara as cold-hearted and selfish, a daughter who had turned her back on the woman who sacrificed everything. His words echoed around the room, each sentence aimed to stab at Zara's reputation. She owes this money, he declared, slamming the paper onto the table. This is not just money, it is respect, it is duty. Her mother nodded along, her smirk growing wider with each word. The crowd whispered in agreement. To them, it looked like Zara was already finished. But Zara didn't flinch. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm. The quieter she was, the louder her mother became. Her silence made her mother bolder, more arrogant, more convinced she had already won. Zara's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She let them perform, let them spin their story, because she knew her moment was coming. Finally, the judge turned his gaze toward her. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" he asked. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes shifting to Zara. For the first time that day, she moved. Slowly, she stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. Her eyes were steady, blazing with a quiet fire. Without a word at first, she placed her folder on the desk, opened it carefully, and began pulling out the papers she had guarded for years. The whispers rose again as she spread them out: receipts, hospital reports, pay stubs, letters. "This," she said clearly, her voice strong and steady, "is the real bill." Gasps filled the room as she lifted each page. "My father paid child support. She kept it. I worked at 13 to survive. I bought my own food. I paid my own fees. And these hospital reports? They show what happened when I collapsed from hunger while she spent the money on herself." Her mother's smirk faltered for the first time. The lawyer stuttered, trying to object, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. The balance in the room shifted. Zara was no longer the accused. She was the one holding the truth, and everyone in that room could feel it. The daughter they called ungrateful had just revealed the story no one expected. And the power in the courtroom now belonged to her. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the sound of papers sliding as Zara began to place them on the desk. One by one, she laid out the evidence she had guarded for years. First came the receipts, money her father had sent for her care, money that had vanished into her mother's pockets instead of feeding or clothing her. The crowd leaned forward, straining to see, and whispers rippled through the room. Next, Zara placed the hospital reports, documents that showed how she had fainted from hunger and neglect, while her mother pretended to be the one making sacrifices. Gasps escaped from the benches as people exchanged shocked glances. This wasn't the story they had been told. Her mother's grin began to waver, but Zara wasn't finished. She pulled out pay stubs from her teenage jobs, scrubbing dishes, babysitting, sweeping floors. At 13, Zara said, her voice steady but sharp, I was working just to survive, while she kept the money my father left for me. Each paper hit the desk like a hammer, breaking down the wall of lies her mother had built. The family members who had once clapped in agreement at the dinner table now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes dropping to the floor. Her mother tried to hold her smile, but the cracks showed. The lawyer stuttered, fumbling for words. Your Honor, this cannot, but before he could finish, the judge raised his hand. Enough, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the air. The lawyer fell silent. The judge's attention was now fully on Zara, and so was the crowd's. The room no longer saw her as the accused daughter on trial. They saw her for what she was, the child who had been robbed, silenced, and betrayed, standing tall at last. The shift in the room was electric. Where her mother's lawyer had once dominated with his voice, now Zara's truth carried more weight than any speech he could deliver. Each piece of evidence wasn't just paper. It was a story, a wound, a revelation. With every page she turned, the power moved further away from her mother and into her own hands. Zara's silence earlier had been her weapon, and now her words landed like blows, undeniable and sharp. Her mother sat frozen, the color draining from her face. The smirk that had carried her through weeks of gossip and judgment was gone. For the first time, she looked small, cornered, exposed. The woman who had marched into court demanding $60,000 was now the one who looked like she owed a debt far greater. By the time Zara finished, the courtroom was buzzing, not with gossip this time, but with disbelief and awe. Neighbors who had whispered ungrateful under their breath now stared wide-eyed, ashamed of how quickly they had judged her. The truth was out, laid bare on the desk for all to see. And in that moment, Zara was no longer the accused daughter. She had become the accuser, and the entire room knew it. The entire courtroom held its breath. The evidence lay scattered across the desk like sharp glass, each piece cutting into the story Zara's mother had tried to sell. The judge picked up one of the papers, adjusted his glasses, and read quietly to himself. The silence stretched on, heavy and tense. Every person in the room leaned forward, waiting for his words. Zara stood tall, her hands steady at her sides, while her mother fidgeted in her chair, her once proud shoulders now hunched. Finally, the judge set the paper down and leaned forward. His eyes locked on Zara's mother, and his voice came out steady and stern. If anyone here owes a debt, he said slowly, letting the words sink in, it is you, madam. A loud gasp spread across the courtroom. The smug grin that had been glued to her mother's face completely vanished. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but couldn't find a single word. The judge wasn't finished. He slammed his gavel once, the sound echoing off the walls. This court finds that you have committed fraud for years. You took money meant for your child's care, and you left her to suffer while you enriched yourself. You dared to present this court with a false bill, yet it is you who must now pay. His voice grew firmer with every sentence, cutting away any last shred of her defense. The lawyer beside her sat frozen, too embarrassed to even stand. The crowd broke into murmurs. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered that justice had finally spoken. The same people who had once called Zara ungrateful were now staring at her with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. Zara's mother shifted uncomfortably, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could stop her fall. But the judge had already made it clear, there was no escape. He lifted the gavel again and struck it down with finality. "This court orders you," he said firmly, "to pay damages for the years of fraud and neglect. You came seeking $60,000. Instead, it is you who will pay." The room erupted in shocked gasps and whispers. The bill that was meant to crush Zara had flipped entirely. The hunter had become the hunted, the accuser the accused. Zara didn't move. She didn't shout or gloat. She simply let the words settle into the air like a truth that had been waiting too long to be spoken. Her mother had walked into the courtroom thinking she would walk out richer. Instead, she walked out carrying a debt she could never escape, not just in money, but in shame. The law itself had turned against her, and Zara, the girl they called ungrateful, stood tall as the one finally vindicated. The courthouse doors swung open and a wave of cameras and microphones rushed forward. Reporters shouted Zara's name, flashes lit up her face, and strangers pressed closer, eager to capture every second. But Zara didn't rush, didn't raise her hands, didn't cry or celebrate. She walked calmly through the crowd, her shoulders straight, her eyes fixed ahead. Behind her, her mother stumbled out, pale and shaken, the once proud woman now drowning in whispers and judgmental stares. Her family, the same uncles and aunties who had clapped at the dinner table, stood frozen on the courthouse steps. They avoided her gaze, their earlier confidence now gone. Zara passed them without a word. She didn't need to argue anymore, the truth had already spoken louder than anything she could say. When she reached her mother, who was trying to hide her face from the cameras, Zara leaned in close. In a voice only she could hear, Zara whispered, "You raised me? No, you build me. Now the world has built you back." The cameras caught the moment, the soft words, the steel in her eyes. That short clip spread online within hours, shared by thousands, then millions. People everywhere called her brave, called her powerful, called her a voice for children who had suffered in silence. While Zara stayed quiet at home, the world turned her into a symbol of strength. Her mother, meanwhile, was left to face the heavy shame she had written for herself. Every lie, every clap, every smug smile had led to this moment. Zara didn't need revenge. The truth had been enough. And now the world was watching her mother finally pay the price.